This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.
Hello and welcome to America Daily. I'm Jessica Beatty. Today we continue our series on Soviet communism. In our first episode, we talked about the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. We also heard from a woman who grew up in the Soviet Union. She shared how communism impacted her and her family. Today, we talk about one of the most infamous Soviet agencies, the Gulag prison camp system. Here's a short explanation of what the Soviet Gulag was like from the infographics show.
The Soviet Gulag, infamous slave labor camps that persisted for 3 decades and killed hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens. Years after the fall of the Soviet Union and the lifting of the Iron Curtain, details on the Soviet Gulag can still be hard to come across, and survivors even rarer. Most prisoners were worked to death or so malnourished or crippled by their experience that their lifespans were cut tragically short, even after release. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're taking a look at what life inside the Soviet Gulag was like. First established in 1919, the Gulag was created by Vladimir Lenin as a prison camp for common criminals and wealthy peasants known as kulaks. Because collectivization basically eliminated the prosperity of many kulaks by forcing them to give up their private farms and pool them together into public farms, they revolted or protested against it, earning themselves a swift arrest and imprisonment for a few years of hard labor. Lenin showed restraint in his use of the Gulag as a punishment tool, however, reserving it only for the worst offenders and criminals. Yet after Lenin's death and Stalin's rise to power, one of the first things Stalin did was to dramatically increase the population of the gulags and oversee a rapid expansion of more labor camps. Anyone deemed an enemy of the state could be sent to a gulag, often with absolutely no trial. During Stalin's Great Purges, where he rid the government of opposing members of the Communist Party, the Gulag was the destination of choice for former military officers and government officials who were deemed disloyal. That is, if they avoided a simple bullet to the back of the head. As the purges continued and grew in scope, Stalin began rounding up doctors, writers, intellectuals, students, artists, and scientists. Anyone who could oppose Stalin publicly and whip up public support could not be tolerated. Yet it wasn't just the accused who were targeted for imprisonment, as anyone with direct ties to the accused could also be rounded up and thrown in a gulag. During the German invasion in World War II, Stalin issued an order that any Red Army soldier who retreated from battle would be sent to the Gulag. And for any soldier who surrendered to the Germans, their entire family would be sent in their place. Soviet soldiers thus had a simple choice to make: die under the German onslaught or condemn their families to a decade or more of hard labor and likely death. But what was life actually like inside a Soviet Gulag? For starters, each camp housed a population of both men and women prisoners, often with the two intermingling and living together. This placed women at severe risk, as rapes from both the guards and other prisoners were commonplace. Women would often be forced to find a Gulag husband, a man whom would protect them in exchange for sexual favors. If not, they would often be forced to perform those favors for the prison guards in exchange for some level of protection. Guards could coerce women to do what they wanted with the promises of better food, clothing, or perhaps shelter, or simply do what they pleased with the female prisoners, as they would face absolutely no repercussions for assaulting someone seen as an enemy of the state. Children too were at risk, as they were often thrown into prison camps along with the adult population, and could also face the risk of being preyed upon by both the other prisoners and guards alike. Prisoners received little in the way of clothing, a fact that would prove fatal for many during the harsh Soviet winters. Perhaps 2 or 3 times a year, a prisoner might be able to receive a small clothing allowance, although for the most part prisoners simply took clothing from those who died. Others might craft their own, as in any prison. A cottage industry of sorts sprung up, ran by individuals with talents, ranging from sewing to tattooing. Each person received 2 daily meals, although these were just short of starvation diets. A family of 3, for example, might receive a daily allowance of 140 grams of bread, hardly enough for a single individual. Add on to that the fact that these prisoners were expected to engage in hard labor, and the low food rations were a near certain death sentence. Prisoners would often try to catch their own food in the form of what little wildlife they might encounter, mostly rats and other rodents, though eating insects when available was not out of the question. Boredom would certainly have not been a problem for prisoners in a gulag camp. Not one to let any amount of human misery go to waste, Stalin saw the gulags as an excellent source of free labor, just the thing to modernize a Russia that was far behind its modern competitors. Stalin immediately put the gulag prisoners to work on everything from collective farms to iron and copper mines, and felling trees to provide timber for the growing engine of the Soviet Industrial Revolution. Some of the Soviet Union's greatest engineering achievements were all thanks to slave labor. With the Moscow-Volga Canal, the White Sea-Baltic Canal, and the Kolma Highway all built atop a pile of thousands of dead Gulag prisoners. In a very real sense, the Soviet Union was literally built on a pile of corpses. Prisoners would face 14-hour workdays, 7 days a week, all year round. While the harsh winters would force other industries to shut down, Gulag prisoners would toil in extremely cold weather, often without adequate clothing. Frostbite and hypothermia were common, as were missing toes, fingers, ears, and even noses thanks to the cold. The prisoners were also given very simple and crude tools to work with, and absolutely no safety equipment. 200,000 prisoners would dig the 128 kilometers of the Moscow-Volga Canal with nothing more than pickaxes and shovels, sometimes even just their bare hands. The frozen ground would be difficult to break, and the harsh conditions killed many. Yet in Soviet Russia, there were few problems that couldn't be overcome by simply throwing enough slave laborers at it. The work was so brutal that some prisoners would mutilate themselves to get out of it, going so far as to stick their arms in a wood stove to severely burn themselves. Back home in the Gulag, living conditions were appalling. There was little heating, and the prison facilities were often roughly constructed longhouses that were poorly insulated from the bitter cold. Overcrowding plagued the camps, with prisoners forced to sleep anywhere they could find a place to lay down, amidst dozens of their fellow prisoners. Gangs ran the gulags, preying on the weak and stealing or coercing food and other supplies from weaker prisoners. Most prisoners, however, were not imprisoned for life, but served sentences of varying lengths. Family members of suspected traitors, for example, would receive a minimum sentence of 5 to 8 years, and prisoners who made it to the end of their sentence were permitted to leave. If they worked extremely hard and surpassed their work quotas consistently, some prisoners even qualified for early release. Yet prison sentences could be extended without warning, prompting many prisoners nearing the end of their sentence to commit suicide out of depression. With an average 10% of the total population dying each year, however, making it to the end of your sentence was extremely unlikely. Immediately after Stalin's death in 1953, millions of prisoners were released. Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, was a staunch critic of the camps and most of the late dictator's policies, and very quickly reversed as many as possible. Yet the gulags didn't go away completely. They were, after all, a fantastic source of free labor for a Soviet Union with a weak economy. But Khrushchev did away with the arbitrary sentencing of most dissidents and political adversaries. Instead, the gulags were restructured as prisons for normal criminals, democratic activists, and anti-Soviet nationalists. Not a perfect change, but a far cry from the days of Stalin. The gulags would go on to last until 1987, when Mikhail Gorbachev, grandson of Gulag victims, began the process of completely eliminating them from the Soviet countryside. Though the world knew of the Soviet gulags for decades, very little factual information about them was ever obtained during the Cold War, thanks to very strict censorship. State archives detailing the length and breadth of the Gulag system were also sealed before the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, taking years before official information on this brutal system of forced labor would come to light. Yet, despite the appearance of economically benefiting the Soviet Union through free labor, experts believe that the camps did not make a significant contribution to the Soviet economy, as without adequate food and supplies, Gulag prisoners were simply unequipped to provide productive results.
Coming up next, we hear about the man who exposed life in the Soviet Gulag. Welcome back. Today we're continuing our series on Soviet communism. In today's episode, we're talking about the Gulag slave labor camp system. One of the most famous books about the Soviet Gulag is called The Gulag Archipelago by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. According to famous psychologist Jordan Peterson, this book is one of the most important works of the 20th century. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was born in 1918. Although he wanted to be a writer, he ended up graduating from the Department of Physics and Mathematics at Rostov University in 1941. World War II broke out shortly after that, and he was put in command of an artillery position-finding company. He was on the front lines until 1945, when he was arrested for making disrespectful remarks about Stalin. Solzhenitsyn was sentenced to 8 years in the Gulag, which was considered a mild sentence at that time. After his 8-year sentence was up, he was exiled for life to southern Kazakhstan. During his exile, he taught math and physics, and he had to write in secret. He only published one work in the Soviet Union, and after that, he had to publish in the West. He was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1974, but was able to return to Russia in 1994, after the Soviet Union was dissolved. To get a better idea of Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago, we hear from author Daniel J. Mahoney. He wrote the book Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, The Ascent from Ideology. Dr. Mahoney talks about Solzhenitsyn's time in the camps and how he was able to keep his faith in humanity. Here's an excerpt of Daniel Mahoney's lecture at Hillsdale College in October 2017.
My talk is entitled Judging Communism and All Its Works, Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago Reconsidered. And I'm going to begin by quoting a very famous passage early on in Book 1 of the Gulag Archipelago, a chapter called The Blue Caps. Macbeth's self-justifications were feeble, and his conscience devoured him. Yes, even Iago was a little lamb too. The imagination and the spiritual strength of Shakespeare's villains stopped short at a dozen corpses because they had no ideology. Ideology, that is what gives villainy its long-sought justification and gives the villain the necessary steadfastness and determination. Thanks to ideology, the 20th century was fated to experience villainy on a scale calculated in the millions. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's writings remain the great scourge of the ideological justification of tyranny and terror. The amplification of violence in the 20th century and the soul-numbing mendacity that accompanied it cannot be blamed on purely accidental or contingent considerations, nor can it be explained away as a mere product of the Russian tradition, that's what they do over there, or the residues of an Asiatic despotism alien to modernity and modern progress. Truth be told, the ideological justification of utopia in power is part and parcel of philosophical and political modernity, rooted in the unfounded belief that human nature and society can be transformed at a stroke. The allure of a revolution that inaugurates a radically new human dispensation of progress that leaves human nature behind in its wake are illusions at the heart of what Eric Voegelin aptly called modernity without restraint. The ideological justification of evil haunts modernity and modern progress. And I insist, they are not distinctively Russian phenomena. In opposition to them, Solzhenitsyn appealed to basic verities, such as an unchanging human nature and an order of grace that is capable of elevating human souls that are also capable of great evil. Solzhenitsyn's critique of ideological despotism, of the Soviet or Maoist sort, or Nazi sort for that matter, is at the service of a more fundamental reaffirmation of the drama of good and evil in the human soul. Shorn of every utopian illusion, his work finally points toward catharsis and spiritual ascent. There is not a trace of nihilism or despair to be found in his writings. Light is ontologically prior to darkness, despite the persistence of evil in the human soul. Solzhenitsyn's target was precisely the ideological lie that presented evildoing as a historically necessary stage in the fated progress of the human race. He always insisted that the ideological lie was worse than violence and physical brutality, ultimately more destructive of the integrity of the human soul. After returning to Russia in May 1994, after 20 years of involuntary exile in the West, 18 of those years spent in Cavendish, Vermont, he never wavered in telling the truth about communist totalitarianism and the lies that undergird it. As he never tired of pointing out, the only way forward was through repentance and telling the full truth about communism and all its works. During a talk at the University of Saratov on September 13th, 1995, this is when Solzhenitsyn is already back in post-communist Russia, Solzhenitsyn took aim at those who saw the Soviet regime as some kind of paradise. Pained by how deep illusions ran and how resilient the lie still was, he made clear that, quote, "Since the middle of the 1920s, I have forgotten nothing," end quote. The atmosphere in Lenin's Russia was, he said, already full of cruelty. To those of his interlocutors who whitewashed Stalin, he bore witness to, quote, "the nightmarish beginnings of the 1930s, when the entire edifice of the universe seemed ready to collapse. Everything we knew of human relations was destroyed." That's all a quotation. "The best among the peasants were hurled onto wagons in freezing snow, with their young children receiving no mercy, no display of elementary human decency." Such, Solzhenitsyn said, was the human meaning of class struggle. Millions were killed and deported in what was the greatest crime of the Soviet regime, the great catastrophe for Solzhenitsyn. And that was the killing of the independent peasantry. Many of the victims of the Great Terror of 1937, the people Arthur Koestler writes about, were morally sullied, in Solzhenitsyn's view, by their participation in previous waves of terror and collectivization against so-called enemies of the people. Some of Solzhenitsyn's interlocutors, talking about 1994 and 1995, blamed the destruction of the independent peasantry, the flower of the Russian nation and the Ukrainian nation, I should add, on the impending war. However, Solzhenitsyn remained unimpressed by this transparently mendacious argument. But what if after the war, he asks? He told almost every group he met in those years about a secret decree promulgated by Stalin in 1948 that sentenced those on the Caucasus, the collective farms, who failed to live up to impossible work norms. Almost all were women, since men had largely left the collective farms, to deportation to Siberia. No one had heard of this, absolutely no one. Solzhenitsyn had published this notorious decree in 1993 in his collection, The Peasantry and the State, in the book series Research on Modern Russian History. Such was Solzhenitsyn's retort to those who saw nothing but unadulterated progress in the 70-year experience of Sovietism. And I quote Solzhenitsyn, "Ah, the paradise that was, extraordinary." One hears Solzhenitsyn's voice in its sardonic mode, well known to readers of the Gulag Archipelago, a tried and true way of piercing through the veil of ideological mendacity. In the 3 volumes of the Gulag Archipelago, which appeared in the West between 1973 and 1976 or so, although largely written in utmost secrecy in the winters of 1965 and 1966. Solzhenitsyn wrote the Gulag in the forests of Estonia. That's another story. Solzhenitsyn had already slain the dragon of ideology. He did so with the rhetorical gifts of a world-class writer. He had sifted through the accumulated experiences of 256 collaborators, witnesses to the Soviet camps who had sent him narratives, letters, memoirs, and other eyewitness accounts of applied ideology at work. He, of course, also drew widely on his own firsthand experience of prison, camp, and exile in the Soviet Union. Beginning with the 2007 Russian edition of the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn provided a complete list of these hitherto invisible allies who made the writing of the Gulag Archipelago possible. In this work, he draws widely on their experiences, so much so that the book has been characterized by the Russianist John B. Dunlop as a personalistic feast, since it gives human form to the millions of souls who were unjustly imprisoned or killed by the Bolsheviks. The task of the philosophical poet is that of, quote, discerning the light of the soul beneath the depersonalized and degraded exterior, unquote, of human beings in the camps. But what Solzhenitsyn calls the sparks of the spirit have a power of their own that literature alone can truly incarnate. The Gulag Archipelago is what Solzhenitsyn called in its subtitle an experiment in literary investigation, in no small part because of its power to illuminate the sparks of the spirit that miraculously survived the assaults of ideology. Human nature is more powerful than ideology. God's grace is more powerful than imperfect human nature. He dramatically chronicles what applied ideology can do to both the bodies and souls of human beings. The latter point is crucial. As the great chapter of Volume 2 of Gulag, Our Muzzled Freedom. If you read nothing else, read Our Muzzled Freedom. Solzhenitsyn is also interested in chronicling the lie and betrayal as forms of existence. He's talking about free Soviet life. Soviet communism was a calamity for the living as well as the dead. This quote comes from 1998 from Solzhenitsyn. With their reverse selection, their deliberate destruction of all that was bright, remarkable, of a higher level, the Bolsheviks set about changing the Russian character root and branch, ripping, pulling, and twisting it. This led to what Solzhenitsyn calls a meltdown of the people's morals, a meltdown whose consequences the ex-Soviet peoples are still dealing with. Betrayal of friends, co-workers, and family were ubiquitous. Lying became a way of life. Again, Solzhenitsyn, it was unavoidable. If you want to survive, lie. Lie and pretend. In place of all the good that was dying away, ingratitude, cruelty, and thoroughly rude self-centered ambition now rose and established themselves. Solzhenitsyn makes clear that systematic mendacity, the lie, the ideological lie, would survive the Stalin period, with the lie and small-minded concerns for self-preservation at the center even of post-Stalin Soviet life. As Solzhenitsyn told Yana Sapiets of the BBC in an interview in January 1979, it would take a very long time indeed for Russia to fully recuperate from such a physical and spiritual calamity. What was needed, Solzhenitsyn said, was inner development, not imperial expansion. The disastrous way in which Russia came out from under the rubble of communism in the 1990s, with massive corruption and kleptocracy under Yeltsin, only made matters worse, as Solzhenitsyn makes clear in his 1998 book, Russia in Collapse. And I'm just about nearing the end. The 2010 abridgment of the Gulag Archipelago is still widely taught in Russian high schools. In fact, it is regarded as mandatory or required reading. Natalia Dmitrievna Solzhenitsyn regularly meets with teachers about how to approach the work, teacher resources about how to teach the Gulag Archipelago are readily available on the Russian internet. The present regime, and that means the President Putin and the Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, support the inclusion of Gulag in the curriculum, though some communists and super patriots in the Putin camp only want good things said about Russia and no nasty things. As the author's son, Stefan Solzhenitsyn, recently told me, quote, such people frequently call for Gulag to be ousted from the curriculum, attack Solzhenitsyn, claiming he made it all up, or that he was the West pawn sent to destroy our superpower, and attack Natalia Dmitrievna too for getting the book into the school curriculum. Stefan Solzhenitsyn added that, quote, they have not prevailed, and we hope they will not prevail. The continuing presence of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag in Russian schools, along with One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and Solzhenitsyn's great short story, Matryona's Home, they're all required high school reading, is a sign of hope. October 30th, 2017, will see the opening of Russia's memorial to the victims of political repression under communism, co-funded by the government and donations from civil society. The Solzhenitsyns told me the one thing that couldn't be done was foreign money. The regime would look very askance on that. But this major monument to the victims of 70 years of communist oppression will be dedicated in Moscow on the 30th of October. These two are facts about Putin's Russia and signs that Leninist Stalinism is not simply the subject of nostalgia or apologetics in contemporary Russia. Solzhenitsyn is still a force for truth in the Russia he loves so much. The availability of the Gulag provides hope that the terrible tragedies of the past will not be repeated, and that the remnants of the ideological lie will not go uncontested in post-communist Russia. And in the West, the Gulag Archipelago remains an indispensable warning against the ideological deformation of reality. Thank you.
Stay tuned tomorrow for the next episode in our series on Soviet communism. We'll discuss how traditional culture and morality was impacted during the Soviet era. Once again, I'm Jessica Beatty. Thanks for listening to America Daily. Until next time.
This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.